The massive oak doors of the mansion groaned under the force of Kenji's entrance, swinging wide to reveal a man who looked more like a demon than a mogul. His black suit was torn at the shoulder, and fresh blood, some his, some not, splattered his white silk shirt like an abstract painting of a massacre. Behind him, 6 bodyguards filed in with the synchronized lethality of a firing squad, their hands hovering near concealed holsters, their eyes scanning for any remaining threats from the war they had just left behind. Kenji stopped mid-stride, his jaw clenching with a force that could crack diamonds. The grand foyer, usually a tomb of silent marble, was occupied. Sitting in his oversized leather chair was an elderly black woman with silver hair twisted into a neat, regal bun. She wore a faded floral dress that had seen better decades, and she was humming a soft, melodic lullaby that seemed to pull the oxygen out of the room. "Who the hell is this?" Kenji's voice was a low, lethal growl. The bodyguards moved instantly. 6 weapons were drawn in a blurred sequence of metallic clicks as safeties disengaged. Red laser dots danced across the old woman's chest, centering on her heart with clinical precision. Mabel looked up, blinking slowly through cloudy eyes, and smiled as if the armed men were merely guests at a Sunday brunch. "Nana!" Elena's scream tore through the tension like a blade. She lunged from the shadows of the hallway, her maid's apron fluttering behind her as she threw her body over her grandmother. She wrapped herself around the frail woman, her arms spread wide to catch the bullets she was certain were coming. "Please," Elena sobbed, looking directly into Kenji's cold, dark eyes. "She has dementia. She doesn't know where she is. The home flooded and I had nowhere else to go. I'll leave. I'll disappear. Just please don't hurt her." The hall went deathly silent. The bodyguards waited for the single word that would end 2 lives and keep the Dragon Syndicate's secrets safe. Kenji stood frozen, his fingers closing around the cold steel of his weapon. He stared at Mabel, who was now gently patting Elena's head, confused by the commotion. Then, it happened. The sound no one in the soul underworld ever expected to hear. It was the soft thud of expensive fabric hitting the floor. Kenji's knees hit the marble with a crack that made his lieutenants wince. His weapon clattered to the floor, discarded and forgotten. His hands, usually steady enough to perform surgery or an execution, were trembling violently as he stared at Mabel's face. For the first time in 20 years, the devil felt the sting of salt in his eyes. "Halmoni," he whispered, his voice shattering into 1,000 jagged pieces. "You're alive!" The bodyguards remained frozen, their laser dots vanishing as Kenji raised a trembling hand, a gesture of absolute authority that forced their weapons down. They watched in stunned silence as their untouchable boss crawled forward on his knees until he reached Mabel's feet. He buried his face in her weathered, calloused hands, his entire frame racked with the kind of ancient, guttural sobs that only come from a boy who had finally found his way home. Mabel squinted at him, a flicker of recognition breaking through the fog of her mind. She tapped her wooden cane against the floor twice and sighed. "Look at you, Kenji," she murmured with the weight of 1,000 disappointed meals. "You still haven't eaten properly." In that moment, the hierarchy of the Dragon Syndicate evaporated. The man who ruled the city's docks and shadows was no longer a king. He was just a starving child who had been saved by the only mother he'd ever known. The mansion of the Dragon Syndicate sat atop the hills of Seoul, like a monument to cold, unyielding iron, a place where the air itself seemed to freeze under the weight of Kenji's silence. Within these walls, Kenji was not a man but a ghost of efficiency, a creature who demanded perfection because he had purged himself of every human flaw. He moved through the corridors like a predator in a museum of his own making, eyes tracking the slightest speck of dust on a Ming vase or a smudge on the floor-to-ceiling windows. For Kenji, the world was divided into assets and obstacles. There was no room for the messy, breathing reality of people. His rules were the physical laws of the house: no unauthorized noise, no personal items in sight, and above all, no strangers. Ever. Elena lived in the cracks of this fortress, a shadow tasked with maintaining a perfection she was never allowed to enjoy. Her existence was defined by the rhythmic scrub of a brush against marble and the sting of industrial bleach that had long ago stained the cuticles of her hands. To the men in black suits who stood like statues in every doorway, she was as invisible as the air they breathed, a utility to be used and ignored. And they would step over her while she was on her knees polishing the foyer, their heavy boots narrowly missing her fingers without a single glance of acknowledgement. To them, she wasn't Elena. She was simply the help, a silent ghost who ensured their coffee was hot and their sins were wiped from the floors before dawn. Kenji's cruelty wasn't loud, it was clinical. He didn't need to raise his voice to instill terror. He would walk past Elena as she worked, his eyes never meeting hers, but his presence would cast a cold shadow that made her heart hammer against her ribs. Once, when she had been 5 minutes late to clear his study, he hadn't scolded her. He had simply sat at his desk, staring through her as if she were made of glass, and quietly informed his head of security to deduct a week's pay from her meager salary, money she desperately needed for Mabel's medication. He didn't care about the why, he only cared about the lapse in his machine. In the Devil's Fortress, survival meant being perfect, being silent, and being utterly alone. The sky over Seoul didn't just rain, it mourned, pouring down a relentless freezing deluge that turned the city's neon lights into blurred smears of neon ink. Inside the staff quarters of the mansion, Elena's phone vibrated with a violence that signaled disaster before she even pressed the receiver to her ear. The voice on the other end was frantic, competing with the sound of rushing water and distant alarms. The nursing home's basement had given way under the pressure of the storm, and the facility was being evacuated. And there were no beds left in the temporary shelter, no room for a woman with late-stage dementia who needed constant monitoring. The message was cold and final. You need to come get your grandmother now. The umbrella Elena held as she raced through the streets was useless against the wind, leaving her drenched and shivering by the time she reached the facility. She found Mabel sitting in a wheelchair near the entrance, her floral dress damp at the hem, clutching a worn leather handbag as if it contained the sum of her life. Mabel looked up, her eyes clouded and wandering, and whispered, "Is it time for church, baby?" Elena couldn't answer through the lump in her throat. She simply knelt, kissed her grandmother's cold hand, and began the most dangerous journey of her life. The drive back to the Dragon's Fortress felt like a descent into a nightmare. Every red light was a countdown to a discovery that would end in blood. Elena knew the rules of the house were not mere suggestions. They were the boundaries of Kenji's world, and she was about to shatter the most sacred one. As she pulled into the darkened service alley, her hands shook so violently the keys rattled against the ignition. She helped Mabel out of the car, the elderly woman's wooden cane clicking rhythmically against the wet asphalt, a sound that felt as loud as a gunshot in the oppressive silence of the estate. They crept through the service entrance, moving through the kitchen like thieves. The scent of expensive floor wax and stale air greeted them, the smell of Kenji's absolute control. Elena's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs as she guided Mabel into the tiny, windowless staff room she called home. "Just for tonight, Nana," she whispered, more to herself than the woman who was already beginning to hum a soft, confused tune. "Just until the sun comes up." She tucked Mabel into the narrow cot, her mind racing through impossible solutions, knowing that a single floorboard creak or a stray hum could alert the guards who prowled the halls like wolves. Elena had lived in the shadows of this house for a year, but for the first time, the shadows felt like they were closing in to swallow them both. The silence of the mansion at 3 a.m. was a heavy, suffocating thing, broken only by the muffled roar of the storm outside. Elena was in the north wing, frantically scrubbing a guest bathroom to mask the sound of her own heartbeat, believing her grandmother was safely tucked away in the staff quarters. But dementia is a thief that steals more than just memories. It steals the concept of boundaries. Mabel, driven by a sudden phantom memory of a child crying in the dark, had risen from her cot. She wandered out of the servants' quarters, her wooden cane tapping a soft, rhythmic chord against the cold marble floors as she navigated the labyrinth of shadows. In the center of the fortress, Kenji sat behind his massive obsidian desk, the only light in the room coming from a single desk lamp and the flickering blue glow of security monitors. He had just returned from a brutal negotiation at the docks, and the scent of iron and rain clung to him. His shirt was unbuttoned, Yeet draped over the back of his chair as he used a glass of neat whiskey and a silk handkerchief to clean a jagged gash across his ribs. He was a man of scars, each one a map of a betrayal he had survived. He lived for these quiet hours when he could shed the mask of the dragon and be nothing but the jagged remains of a human being. The heavy office doors, which usually required a biometric scan to open, had been left slightly ajar by a negligent guard, the first mistake in a night that would change everything. Mabel didn't hesitate. She followed the sliver of light, pushing the door open with the casual ease of a woman entering her own kitchen. "Who the hell?" Kenji's hand didn't fumble. It moved with the instinct of a viper, his fingers closing around the cold grip of the Beretta on his desk before he even looked up. At the sound of his voice, the two guards stationed in the hallway burst inside, their movements a blur of tactical precision. The metallic clack of safeties being switched to fire echoed through the vaulted ceiling. Red laser sights cut through the dim light, two crimson dots centering perfectly on Mabel's chest as she stood there, blinking slowly. She didn't look at the guns. She didn't see the men in suits. Her cloudy eyes were fixed on the man behind the desk, specifically on the way he was holding his side. "You're bleeding again, child," Mabel said, her voice soft and steady, carrying a warmth that had no business existing in a room full of assassins. "I told you to be careful with those boys in the alley." The guards hesitated, their fingers twitching on their triggers. They were trained to neutralize threats. But they weren't trained for an old woman in a floral dress who spoke to the devil as if he were a grandson. The tension was a piano wire stretched to the breaking point. Kenji's finger was a fraction of an inch from the trigger, his heart hammering against his ribs with a sudden, violent familiarity. He looked at the woman, then at the wooden cane, and finally at her face. Memory is a strange thing. It can be buried under years of blood and granite, but a single voice can bring it screaming to the surface. Kenji saw the silver hair and the gentle set of her jaw, and suddenly, he wasn't in a mansion in Seoul. He was 8 years old, shivering in a Los Angeles alleyway, and a woman with that exact same voice was raising a cane to ward off his attackers. "Stand down," Kenji rasped, the command barely making it past the lump in his throat. "Boss?" one of the guards questioned, the laser dot still dancing on Mabel's heart. "I said stand down!" Kenji roared, the fury in his voice masking a sudden terrifying vulnerability. As the guards lowered their weapons in stunned confusion, Kenji stood up, ignoring the flare of pain in his side. He didn't move like a predator anymore. He moved like a man who had seen a ghost. He walked around the desk, his eyes locked on Mabel, waiting for the fog of her mind to clear just enough to see the boy he used to be. The office was a tomb of silence, the only sound the ragged, uneven breathing of the men in the room. Kenji stepped out from behind the obsidian desk, his bare chest slick with sweat and the darkening smear of blood. He ignored the stinging gash on his ribs. His focus narrowed entirely on the frail woman standing in the center of his sanctuary. He walked toward her slowly, his shadow stretching long across the marble floor, until he was close enough to see the fine lines of age etched into her face. lines he had traced with his eyes as a terrified child, while she told him stories to drown out the sound of sirens outside her LA apartment. He stopped inches from her. The guards watched with bated breath, their weapons lowered but their bodies coiled, waiting for their boss to snap and end this intrusion. Instead, Kenji reached out with a trembling hand. He didn't grab her. He gently touched the sleeve of her floral dress, his thumb brushing the fabric as if confirming she wasn't a hallucination born of blood loss and exhaustion. 20 years? Kenji whispered, his voice thick and unrecognizable even to himself. I looked for you in every city. They told me the neighborhood was gone. They told me you were dead. Mabel tilted her head, the fog in her eyes swirling before a sudden sharp clarity pierced through. She reached up, her weathered hand catching his chin, tilting his head just as she had done when he was 8 years old and covered in bruises. Her thumb found a small, jagged scar near his hairline, a souvenir from a night he had nearly been beaten to death before her cane struck the pavement like thunder. Minho, she murmured, using the name he had buried under layers of steel and shadow. You still haven't grown into those ears, baby. The words hit Kenji with the force of a physical blow. The dragon of soul, the man who had ordered executions with a casual wave of his hand, felt his knees give way. It wasn't a collapse. It was an act of profound, soul-deep surrender. He didn't just kneel. He folded himself into a perfect, traditional 90-degree bow, his forehead nearly touching the cold marble. It was a gesture of respect reserved for gods, for ancestors, for the person who owns your very life. The guards exchanged panicked glances. They had seen Kenji kill, they had seen him bleed, but they had never seen him humble. To them, this was a crack in the foundation of their empire, a sign of madness. Kenji remained in the bow for a long, agonizing minute before he spoke, his voice ringing out with a cold, absolute authority that brooked no question. Listen to me, he said, still focused on the floor. This woman is not a guest. She is not a stranger. She is the reason this syndicate exists. She is my mother in everything but blood. He stood up, his eyes turning to his men, flashing with a lethal intensity that promised a slow death to anyone who faltered. From this second forward, she is untouchable. If a hair on her head is harmed, if she is spoken to with anything less than total devotion, I will personally burn this city to the ground with you inside it. She is the law of this house. Is that understood? The guards straightened, their faces turning pale as they realized the world had just shifted on its axis. Yes, boss. They echoed in unison, their voices trembling. Kenji turned back to Mabel, the monster gone from his expression, replaced by a raw, desperate hope. He took her wooden cane in one hand and offered her his steady arm with the other. Come, Halmoni, he said softly, you've spent enough time in the dark. It's time you saw the palace I built for you. The transformation of the mansion began before the sun had even cleared the horizon. By Kenji's command, the master suite, a sprawling expanse of glass, silk, and minimalist opulence, was emptied of his cold, clinical belongings. He didn't just give Mabel a room, he abdicated his throne. Within hours, the scent of expensive cologne and gun oil was replaced by the aroma of lavender and home-cooked spices. The staff, who had spent years moving like silent, terrified wraiths, were now a frantic blur of activity, carrying in plush armchairs, fresh orchids, and a medical alert system that cost more than a small apartment. Elena watched from the doorway, her hands clutching a tray of tea, her mind still struggling to reconcile the monster she feared with the man currently kneeling on the floor to adjust the height of her grandmother's footstool. Kenji moved with a strange, frantic energy, as if he could erase 20 years of absence with a few hours of service. He personally inspected the thread count of the sheets and the temperature of the room, snapping at a high-ranking lieutenant who dared to suggest that the master suite was operationally insecure for a civilian. The lieutenant was dismissed with a look that promised a shallow grave, and the house fell into a new, surreal rhythm. The Viper of the East was no longer presiding over war councils in the basement. He was spending his afternoons in a sun-drenched sitting room, surrounded by floral prints and the soft, repetitive humming of an old woman's lullabies. The true breaking point of the syndicate's reality came during dinner 3 days later. The dining hall was a place of legendary dread, where Kenji usually sat in isolated silence, his men standing at attention along the walls like statues of stone. Tonight, however, the atmosphere was thick with a tension of a different kind. Kenji sat at the head of the long mahogany table, his phone buzzing incessantly with reports of unrest at the docks and brewing coups in the city's underbelly. He was mid-sentence, barking a ruthless order to his head of security about breaking the legs of a rival's informant, when a sharp, rhythmic sound cut through the room. Thwack! Mabel's wooden cane had connected firmly with Kenji's shoulder. The entire room stopped breathing. The guards by the door reached instinctively for their holsters, then froze, in their eyes widening as they realized who had struck the dragon. "Language, Minho," Mabel snapped, her voice as sharp and clear as a winter morning. "We do not use that tone at the table, and sit up straight, child. You look like a street thug." Kenji, the man who had once executed a diplomat for a minor slight, didn't move. His jaw tightened, and for a second, the men in the room expected a bloodbath. Instead, Kenji slowly lowered his phone. He rolled his shoulder, his face flushing a deep, embarrassed crimson. "Sorry, Halmoni," he mumbled, his voice dropping an octave in genuine submission. "And your greens," she added, pointing her cane at the pile of untouched broccoli on his gold-rimmed plate. "You're all skin and bone. You won't grow big and strong on whiskey and spite. Eat!" In a silence so profound you could hear the hum of the refrigerator 3 rooms away, the most feared man in Seoul picked up his silver fork. Under the watchful, uncompromising gaze of a woman in a floral dress, he began to eat his vegetables. He chewed with a grimace, looking every bit the pouting 8-year-old he had once been in a Los Angeles kitchen. Elena bit her lip to keep from laughing, noticing the way the stone-faced butler's hand trembled as he poured more water. The legend was true. Kenji was a devil, but even a devil had to answer to his mother. The storm that had been brewing over Seoul finally broke, but the thunder that rattled the mansion's windows at 0200 hours was not made of clouds. It was the synchronized percussion of suppressed submachine guns and the shattering of reinforced glass. In the East Wing, the biometric sensors, the electronic nervous system of the fortress, sighed into a programmed sleep, courtesy of Sora's betrayal. The darkness of the hallways was suddenly sliced by red tactical lasers, cutting through the shadows like hungry eyes. The Viper's hit squad moved with the fluid, silent grace of professional Terminators, their mission clear: find the heart of the house and stop it. Kenji was awake before the first door hit the floor. His instincts, honed by a lifetime of looking over his shoulder, screamed of a breach before the alarms even had a chance to fail. He didn't reach for his shoes. He reached for the twin Berettas under his pillow. By the time he reached the master suite's door, the sounds of his loyalist guards dying in the foyer were already echoing up the grand staircase. The mansion, his impenetrable castle, had become a slaughterhouse. "Boss, we have to move." His head of security, a man still loyal to the old blood, skidded into the hallway, blood streaming from a gash on his forehead. "The East Wing is gone. We have a subterranean armored car waiting. If we leave through the wine cellar now, we can make the safe house in Jeju by morning." Kenji looked at the armored car keys, then at the heavy doors of the master suite. Behind those doors, Mabel was likely sitting up in bed, confused by the noise, and Elena was undoubtedly shielding her with nothing but her own trembling body. In the underworld, the rule was simple. The king survives, so the empire can live. To stay was a death sentence. To run was a promotion. "Get the car ready," Kenji said, his voice a low, vibrating hum of fury. Yes, boss. Write this. Not for me, Kenji interrupted, his eyes flashing with a light that made the veteran guard recoil. For them. But the sensors are down and they've bridged the perimeter. If I move her now, she's a target in the open. I am not putting her in a car just to have it flipped by an RPG. But boss, they're coming for her. If you stay here, you're choosing to die in a corner. Kenji checked the magazine of his weapon with a clinical click. I lost her once to a car that pulled away while I screamed her name in the rain. I spent 20 years being a ghost because I thought she was gone. I am not leaving her again. He turned his back on the escape route, facing the darkened hallway where the first of the Viper's men were rounding the corner. Tell the men who are still loyal to hold the stairs. This isn't an evacuation anymore. It's a stand. The heavy doors of the master suite opened, and Elena stood there, her face white with terror, clutching Mabel's wooden cane. Mabel stood behind her, her eyes unusually sharp in the gloom, her hand resting on Elena's shoulder. She didn't look like a woman lost in dementia. She looked like a mother watching her son prepare for a storm. Go back inside and lock the door, Kenji commanded, his voice softening only for a microsecond. No matter what you hear, do not open it until you hear my voice. Do you understand? Kenji, Elena whispered, seeing the sheer number of red dots appearing on the far wall. There are too many of them. Then I'll just have to be faster, Kenji replied. He stepped into the center of the hallway, a lone silhouette against the luxury of his empire, his body positioned as a human barricade. He wasn't the Viper of the East anymore, calculating odds and weighing assets. He was the boy from the alley, finally old enough and strong enough to stand in front of the woman who had once stood in front of him. As the first flashbang grenade rolled down the carpet, Kenji didn't blink. He raised his weapons, his heart beating with a ferocious, singular purpose. Nobody touches his mother. The hallway was a choked corridor of strobe lights and acrid cordite, a nightmare of luxury being torn apart by lead. Kenji moved with a predatory grace that defied his exhaustion, his twin Berettas barking in the darkness as he neutralized the first wave of intruders. He was a whirlwind of precision, but even the dragon could not outrun the volume of fire pouring from the stairwell. The Viper's men were professionals. Merson, they had realized that to kill the king, they only had to aim for the door behind him. A flashbang detonated with a deafening roar, turning the world into a blur of ringing white. Through the haze, Kenji saw the master suite door splinter. Elena had tried to hold it, but the force of a tactical kick sent her reeling backward. Mabel stood there, framed in the doorway, her wooden cane raised like a scepter of ancient defiance. She wasn't cowering. She was stepping forward, her lips moving in a prayer or a command, her presence an affront to the masked men who lived by the gun. Target sighted, a voice screamed over the din. Kenji saw it in a fractured second, the barrel of a submachine gun swinging away from him and toward the elderly woman in the floral dress. The world slowed to the crawl of a heartbeat. There was no time to aim, no time to reload, and no tactical maneuver that could bridge the gap. In that vacuum of time, Kenji didn't act as a Mafia don. He didn't calculate the survival of his syndicate or the cost of his empire. He acted on the ancient instinct of a debt that could only be paid in bone and blood. He threw himself across the marble floor, his body a living bridge of meat and silk. The hammer fell. The lead tore through the air, but instead of finding the frail chest of the woman who had saved a boy in Los Angeles, the bullet slammed into Kenji. The impact spun him mid-air, a violent, jagged jolt that sent him crashing to the floor at Mabel's feet. White-hot agony blossomed in his shoulder and side, a searing heat that threatened to pull him into the black. Minho! Mabel's voice pierced through the ringing in his ears, no longer cloudy, but sharp with a mother's terror. Kenji gasped, blood bubbling at the corner of his mouth, but he didn't stay down. He forced himself up onto one knee, his left arm hanging uselessly, his right hand still gripping his weapon with a white-knuckled ferocity. He looked up at the gunman. his eyes burning with a light that looked less like a man and more like a god of vengeance. The hitman froze, momentarily paralyzed by the sight of a man who should be dead rising to continue the fight. My turn, Kenji wheezed. He fired 3 times. The shots were a single, continuous roar. The gunman collapsed, and the remaining attackers, seeing their leader fall and the devil still standing despite the red staining his shirt, felt the first cold touch of panic. They had been told they were hunting a man who had gone soft. And they hadn't been told that a man with something to protect is the most dangerous animal on Earth. Elena scrambled to Mabel's side, her hands pressing against Kenji's wounds in a desperate attempt to stop the life from leaking out of him. Kenji, stay with us, please. Kenji leaned his head back against the doorframe, the cold marble a sharp contrast to the fire in his veins. He looked up at Mabel, who was cradling his head in her lap, her weathered fingers stroking his hair just as they had done 20 years ago in a different storm. The blood on his hands was his own this time, and as he looked at the 2 women he had kept safe, a strange, terrifying peace settled over him. For the first time in his life, he didn't feel like a monster. He felt like a son. The silence that followed the war for the mansion was not the cold, hollow quiet of a tomb, but the heavy, expectant hush of a fever breaking. In the days that followed, the Dragon Syndicate underwent a purge that was surgical and absolute. Lieutenant Sora and those who had traded their loyalty for the Viper's gold did not return from the shadows. They became a cautionary tale whispered in the back alleys of Seoul, a reminder that the only thing more dangerous than Kenji's wrath was his devotion. The underworld watched in stunned disbelief as the Devil of Seoul dismantled the very foundations of his empire, replacing the glass walls of fear with the reinforced concrete of a blood oath. He didn't just rule the city anymore. He protected it, governing with a new, terrifying clarity that came from having something worth losing. Weeks later, the morning sun filtered through the master suite's floor-to-ceiling windows, turning the once clinical room into a sanctuary of amber light. The scars on Kenji's shoulder and side remained, jagged, raised reminders of the lead he had swallowed, but the darkness in his eyes had receded, replaced by a grounded, quiet strength. He sat at a small, circular table draped in lace, a far cry from the obsidian desk where he used to sign death warrants. Across from him, Elena poured tea, her movements no longer hurried or fearful. She wore a dress of her own choosing, her status as the Maid buried under the weight of the word Kenji now used to introduce her, sister. She had stood in the line of fire when the world collapsed, and in the aftermath, she had become the architect of the house's new heart. She watched Kenji with a knowing smile, no longer seeing a monster, but a man who was finally learning how to breathe. "You're slouching again, Minho," a familiar, sharp voice rang out. Mabel entered the room, her wooden cane tapping a steady, comforting rhythm against the polished floor. She looked vibrant, the best medical care in the country having cleared the worst of the fog from her mind, though she still preferred the simple floral dresses of her Los Angeles days to the silks Kenji tried to buy her. She took her seat at the table with the regal grace of a queen returning to her throne. Kenji immediately straightened his back, the feared Mafia Don reacting with the Pavlovian instinct of a scolded schoolboy. "Sorry, Halmoni," he murmured, a genuine, lopsided smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. He reached out. His hand, once stained with the ink of crime and the blood of rivals, gently covering Mabel's weathered fingers. There were no guns on the table, no burner phones, no ledgers of debt. There was only the steam rising from the bowls of rice and the quiet domestic sounds of a family at peace. Kenji realized then that his greatest achievement wasn't the skyscrapers he owned or the docks he controlled. It was the fact that he could sit in this room, vulnerable and unarmed, and feel completely safe. As Mabel began to say, "Grace," her voice steady and warm, Kenji closed his eyes. He had spent 20 years building a fortress to keep the world out, only to realize that the only thing that mattered was who he let in. The legend of the devil was dead. In its place stood a man who knew that true power didn't come from the ability to take a life, saw it from the honor of protecting one. They ate together in the golden light, the boss, the sister, and the grandmother. A new dynasty built not on the shifting sands of terror, but on the unbreakable bedrock of a debt finally repaid.